Hello everyone and welcome to H620, and now I changed to a completely different place. Here it's very little space, it seems, full with boundaries, very narrow, and you even have to crawl the last bit. We are in the famous well of St. Paul the Apostle. He visited in his journals in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. And as you can see, I'm very deep into the mountain, and here we feel crammed, but thinking of space opens up and you get a more liberated feeling of there being space available even in this partitioned and crowded area. Let's see here. One could see the boundaries as being explicit and space being implicit. I can almost stand here. Let's see if I can angulate that a little bit more. Oops, daisy. One could see boundaries around an object and the space surrounding it to be a specific explicit take on something that is implicit. Having those two levels of seeing could be the first stepping stone to get into what is space really. I would write an article for Jan, and it's for the Klein bottle. And the Klein bottle is an excellent tool to demonstrating that you can have boundaries, firm boundaries, established boundaries, but it can also be something more encompassing, a space. And Klein bottle is what space does. It's traits, properties, characteristics of space. Space does that. And just perceiving it, looking at it, thinking about it, makes you understand that space is something much more than confined spaces only. That is one explicit form it can take. But under the explicit you have an implicit reality that is more encompassing. And it's in this movement from explicitness to implicitness that you found this greater movement. And this greater movement can be perceived while you look at an ambigram. An ambigram has a movement that is more fundamental than the movement we usually talk about. It's an implicit movement, and this movement in the ambigram is before what we call solids or non-solid movement and non-movement. This is a more profound movement. It's a movement that it's not limited to be in the Newtonian space where something leaves a point of departure x, y, z, 1, 2, 5, and arrives at x, y, z, 6, 5, 4, something like that. This is the Newtonian way of looking at movement. It's explicit. but there is a more fundamental movement. Of course, there was a movement before we had Newton. It doesn't have to be this way that we limit ourselves to see movement today. We don't know what movement really is in the implicit way. We only have this Newtonian movement. And if you're not a professional football player, if you're not training your body daily since decades, we're doing something that takes that you need to understand space in a more fundamental way. Your perception of movement will be the Newtonian. There's no doubt of that. You will not have the more encompassing feel of movement, because our perception of movement changed radically with Newton. It became something completely different. But there is a more fundamental, more profound, simpler in a way movement. But this is an observable movement, whereas what most people see as movement is something they can never observe. It's the corpus callosum once again shutting out perception, impressions. And you just say you saw movement, but you cannot see it. You can't see anything when the corpus callosum shuts up. You're literally off from perception. We'll need some lighting here. So what we could do is direct our interest, our knowledge to space at a more fundamental level, where everything originates, because it's the necessary foundation for both objects and what we on our level 1, perceive to be space and objects. And this is very similar to the relation I mentioned about motion and a more original motion. Not a Newtonian XYZ motion going from one place to another, but a perceptible, observable motion. This space aspect is considerably more vast, and it encompasses everything we know, and it also leads us beyond. Well, what a fitting place to talk about beyond. Beckoning ever beyond, but rather than attending to this infinite and transcendent character of space, intellectual energy buzzes itself. We're trying to keep up with the infinite wealth of information, so to be had about objects. Meanwhile, space unlocked objects remain infinite in a way that is untrackable and ungraspable. And here, of course, you have Niels Bohr's unanalyzable. It amounts to the same thing. The explicit electron is based on something more profound, and that's the implicit reality. It's a change of level. It's important to understand that. Whereas we change the level, and this is what Niels Bohr is pointing to, we will perceive different things. And the reason for level being part of the explanation is the subject is always there. It's only in Newtonian physics we don't talk about the subject, and therefore there won't be any levels of understanding. I would even further that to say that understanding is always levels. And you don't have understanding if you don't have levels. Of course, a primitive or simple sign like a stop sign on the road is something that will be understood by everyone, almost everyone. But there is always a level of understanding. The understanding of the stop sign can be shallow and it can be deeper. So look out, and I think that goes to show the modern man today having no perception of what level he is at that instant, because we as human beings, we have different levels during the day. Sometimes we are more awake, sometimes we are more tired. We narrow, and this narrowing of focus is, I recommend you to perceive, because that's an important first step in the direction of noticing the levels. But this narrowing is, well, it's perfect now. It's like 5, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. There you will discover the first narrowing of focus. Starts a bit earlier, and it is there, trust me. This is siesta time. And if you don't perceive any narrowing in that time period, you need to look harder. It goes to show you don't have insight into the embodiment. You're up in the transcendental head. Many thanks for that description, Richard E. Lind. So depending on what level of analysis, we will find objects that entice, interest, and preoccupy us. But we can also find immeasurable more space. And by contemplating that this space, we may be able to open up and experience a level of relaxation and satisfaction which we are usually unable to touch through our preoccupation with things. And what Tartan Tolku is referring here is the thinginess, the object-oriented observation, that we get almost stuck in a certain level and aspect of explicit. And beforehand, because that's here you also have a before and an after. We try to see objects before we perceive them. And that's a break against the rule of ex posteriori, ex anteriori. And we know that. We have object eyes today. And you could say that started already when we left the Iliad and the Odyssey, when we started to use completely new vocabulary. And we skipped that more informed way of talking about gaze and looking, and starting to fixate in a certain explicit way by seeing things. an arbitrary division between two things. And this became what we call subject-object divide. But of course this is an arbitrary setting. Settings can be made, focal settings can be changed, but this is arbitrary. It's not precise, if you say. It came into birth not by informed knowledge, by intention. And that's something I mentioned the other day, that we see in the post-Newtonian world reality to be something that is objective in the sense that two different people can make the same observation, do the same experiment. And this is not objectivity in quantum physics. Far from it. That's subjectivity in quantum physics. Especially in this point, the two physics are extremely different. Because if you don't take the subject into the equation, you will always strand with a subjective object that maybe not even can be understood by others. It becomes ununderstandable even to the person. Once again, the Wittgensteinian critique of inner language game, which is impossible. So we cannot perceive an objective space, and it's not a good thing that two different people, two different experiments show up with the same thing. So we come to appreciate things that are indicative that we are not in reality as being signs of reality. And this is, interesting enough, exactly the same mistake that Plato and Parmenides and Zenon made. They were looking in the wrong alley, and they went further and further away from reality. Just because they thought in their mind what was objective should be more thoroughly investigated, and then you will find reality. This is what Plato suggests. Well, that's the wrong turn. You will find less and less of reality if you go in that way. A little bit like I've gone now. I've gone the furthest down under the mountain, down in the catacomb. It's staggering 60-70 meters of rock above me. But still talking about these things makes a feeling of it being space here, of spaciousness. And another example could be a move from one culture to another one. In the Oriental societies in East Asia, you will experience extreme crowdedness from our Newtonian perspective. But you will see people be extremely relaxed in a situation that cannot be called any other than extremely claustrophobic for anyone, I would say. I have a keen remembrance of being on the metro, the subway, the underground, and there is a pusher outside that pushes people inside the van, inside the tram. So we're so crowded, there's barely any space to breathe. And they have special ventilators that heightens the pressure, because you will eventually not get any air. There's too many people. But they pressure up the vans, pressure up the trams to get people to have air. And there people are standing and they look like they have all the space in the world. If that's possible, that's also possible for us. And it used to be possible. People used to live very, very crowded, crammed, and still finding space. And we know today people don't find mental space. It gets so crowded inside their heads, so in the end, they can't even perceive the space in between thoughts. They go like a long interconnected train, way, way out without any direction. And this is this lack of direction, both in time, in space, that is so typical of the Newtonian first level space. It lacks direction. And the people inside Newtonian space, they appreciate, see that as a good thing. That's the watermark of something being good. It has a high value. This doesn't have any intention. There is no direction in this. And therefore they say, that's good. We need more of that stuff. Just like Plato, just like Parmenides, and just like Voltaire, and of course D'Holbach. D'Holbach appreciated going out in the world and observing the whole thing objectively, which he did, without a doubt. And he came back with a result that was objective and could be understood by everybody else, directly more or less. And that was seen as a good thing. And this is a part of reality which is new to mankind. It doesn't have many centuries, and this is the perception of sameness. A word that didn't used to be very significant, but today in level 1 space have become the foundation, sameness. And the objects are also same. It's like we're taking all the properties out of space by calling things objects only. Object could be one level focal setting, and in the end we forget we can change the focus. We don't have any connection to our inner thoughts anymore. And that means that you have no control over the focal setting anymore. You're stuck in one focal setting. And that's really a one-patterned mind, a one-patterned head. It's a stiffness. Just by contemplating space in its vastness and seeing the surfaces dissolve. And you do that with the things you perceive, because what you perceive is Newtonian. You don't perceive reality as it is. You grew up in the Western world and you're listening to this. You have the Newtonian space. So opening up will relax you. Opening up will relax both subject and object. And as we mentioned, and as I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, we don't know in physics whether it's the object seeing the subject or the subject seeing the object, because they appear simultaneously. For us to be able to say one causes the other one, or one perceives the other one, there has to be a time lag. But there isn't any time lag. It's directly. And this is that weirdness that Einstein called spooky action at a distance, entanglement. Things are interconnected in a direct mode that happens instantaneous. And the distance has no effect at all with instantaneity. Doesn't matter if the distance is, as this Austrian scientist demonstrated a couple of years ago on the Canary Islands, even when he looked at the most distant pulsar stars, I think it was, in the two furthest corners we human beings can have any observance. As far as light has gone to the Earth, I think it was 20 million light years. And he directed one telescope in one direction to one pulsar being situated one end of the universe, and he directed one to the other part of the universe, and he found entanglement on the greatest distance possible, instantaneous. And that goes to show that also applies for Federer. To say that first it was Federer and then it was the ball, or to say the ball came first and then it was Federer in the situation, it's completely wrong in quantum physics. It's simultaneous occurrence. And this is of course extremely weird from a normal perspective, there's no doubt about it. And even if I'm saying this to you, it might sound natural to you, it sure isn't for me. I almost cussed there. I can't do that at the well in St. Paul's Well. But if you try too hard, and this could be interesting, try to track space by itself to any great degree, we may fall into confusion or experience a kind of blackout. And that has to do with, we are so used to seeing space as just one thing, as surrounding space. Like the negativity Betty Edwards, the very pedagogical drawing artist, showed that we can draw better by focusing on the negative surfaces, the things surrounding the objects. We are not used to attending space in itself. We fall down into a blackout almost. So this restful space within object may appear a little bewildering, and space considered safe may appear meaningless or perhaps even forbidding. And this is very interesting, also in comparison to what we call more primitive people, nomadic people. They have this more, well, for obvious reasons, they don't have many objects. And that does actually help. It does do a difference. You have a lot of objects, you're more used to thinking in terms of object, but not necessarily so. You can have a whole house crowded with objects without being stuck into them. It's not the same thing, but it does help to have fewer objects. They are much better in observing and taking in space as such, the more fundamental space, implicit space, so to speak. And that's the reason why nomadic people, for instance, move about, are more relaxed. They don't slump in the same way, they don't collapse in sofas, chairs, you name it. They always have space around them, even in crowded areas. I don't remember that tale, but I think it was some Indian tribe. They used for the construction works, for instance, Empire State Building, because they were much less affected by heights. Not only were they better at perceiving space where there were none, like in a submarine, which is quite a crowded place if you ask me, they didn't lose their track while standing on these building blocks that made up Empire State. Because you lack your, in Newtonian space, in Newtonian movement and all that, you lack your orientation, because you need to be oriented towards the ground. And the ground is something that's situated in reality, not in a Newtonian constructed space. And now the people are standing mostly on their toes, not all, but most of us. We are already on our toes, we are ready to act. The fast twitching muscles can't wait to overreact to what we, before we even see them, labels as objects. And most often, erroneously so. Don't forget the experimentation man made on Western people in contrast to nomadic, more original people. They perceive the objects better. And that's one interesting aspect. Getting set on one focal level will diminish your possibility to see the objects. So your wish to see more objects, your preemptive stance of trying to see them, will stop you from seeing them for obvious reasons, because you are trying to do something like Steven Weinberg, for instance, if you remember him. You do things in the wrong order, and that won't work. Reality won't yield to that. You need to let the objects come to you. And this is this preemptive, what can you say, reach for space. You want the space before it's there, or the defined boundaried space. And that's not how reality comes by. First you see, and then you perceive space and objects. And when we come into a room, we can't see the differences. We can't see what's around us. And here you have something that really helps, and that's having a more simplified surrounding, a clearer surrounding. And it does help a lot to have it clean, because this fussiness, this extra stuff everywhere, and the uncleanliness, it's a little bit the cloudiness we have, we modern people, in our heads with all the objects tangling around. It is unclean. Not in a metaphorical sense, this is literal meaning, it's unclean. It's a mess inside the head. And you will be helped having order in your life by having order outside. Remember the Klein bottle? There's no difference between inside and outside. They are also the same, although definitely otherwise. And if you look at nomadic people, they don't leave a mess around them. They have an excellent track. Very interesting story that from Cajete, I think it's supposed to pronounce, of nomadic people always, nomadic primitive people always knowing what they have around them. They know the names of the plants, the animals, the trees, the vegetables, the fruits, the different parts of the soil. They all have names for that. We used to have the same, but we're starting to say that the space around us is not part of our reality, and therefore also the knowledge of the space around us came to be sort of shoved into the background, not as present anymore. And this is an interesting aspect. This has a huge effect on knowledge. we are not as knowledgeable in Newtonian space-time knowledge as we are in what was before Newton. And we need to understand that the knowledge base has diminished. We have scattered information, and it's indirectly hinted that you need to gather all those explicit tidbits and information sticks wherever they come to you, and you need to sort of process them like somebody processing milk or something. And out comes a homogenized end product, some sort of knowledge yogurt you can use to move about in the world. Maybe a little bit the knowledge of Trivial Pursuit. That won't work. Definitely won't work, I'm afraid. We need to opening up to a greater knowledge. And that is also what David Bohm mentioned as implicit knowledge. Because the more we train this to see space, to acknowledge space, it gets easier. There is a development. The three factors I would pinpoint as Newtonian physics does not acknowledge. The development is one thing. There's a constant development. It never ends. It wouldn't make any sense to say development ends. And the levels change. Whereas in Newtonian it's a little bit like Plato and Socrates. The knowledge is just hidden maybe, and you need to uncover it, but it's always been there. And this is very similar how the mathematicians today, 95% of them, who are realists when it comes to mathematics, they not uncommonly say that the mathematical rules, formulations, in some sense have always been there. And therefore also this cramped need to have the numbers always having existed somewhere. Nobody knows where, but they always existed. They have to in this logic. On the first level logic, it's a demand that the figures, the numbers always existed, long before they were even invented. And for some mad reason, these figures, which is, for me, this is one of the points we've been doing so hard the last couple of years. I've been feeling the absurdity of this idea since a long time ago. And this is this whole idea that mathematics is ruling the universe. So something is being counted somewhere outside the universe. So the physical laws of the universe are mathematical, and they need to be counted somewhere. And where that should take place, I don't know. But it sure as, I won't pronounce it, it has to be an extremely big place. It needs to be bigger than the universe to calculate all the laws if they somehow were mathematical. You see how it all comes together. On the level one, numbers need to be real. And also the objects need to be real. And they have to be the only reality. There cannot be any alternative, cannot be a change of focal setting. Objects must be the only reality. And a more open solution is to say the objects could be one aspect, but not the only one. But the objects don't like to hear that, maybe. It's a bit like that. It's like opening up slowly, because there's a progression. So we both have levels and there is a progression. Whereas knowledge in Newtonian is instantaneous or almost instantaneous, And you could have had that knowledge 10 years ago if you only read the right books or stumbled upon the right information. That idea. Level, progression, getting up. And the world, I think that's the third. The world will be different as you progress. Can never be the same on a different level. So, and that progression is on the positive scale. There won't be any progression into the negative scale. It won't be a stop, and it won't be a progression into the negative scale, because there is a direction, and that direction is always positive, not in contrast to something that would be negative. And that's the Hollow movement. The Hollow movement is not a movement in contrast to something that is stable. It's very important to understand. Hollow movement is not contradiction to stability. It's the foundation of stability, permanence, and what we perceive in explicit term to be movement. It's something much more fundamental. And it doesn't take stableness as is opposite. Very, very important to understand. That needs to be understood before one can go further into the investigation. Very important. You might pinpoint that. But it's really, really interesting with the Hollow movement. It reminds me a bit about the wave John Appleton mentioned. Because that's not a movement in ordinary terms. He calls it frozen wave. That's most interesting as well. Well, I think this is a very calming place. I like this place. Maybe there will be opportunity to return to this place. But I say thank you from the well of St. Paul, and I bid you a very pleasant evening.